Good morning or good afternoon, and thank you for attending our peer-to-peer forum. Today's call is the fourth part of a five-part series on the habits of the highly successful CFO. Today, we'll focus on CFO as cross-functional team builder. Our speakers today are Jack McCullough, founder and president of the CFO LC, Jonathan Bigham, COO of Coffee Labs and co-chair of the New York City Chapter, along with Chris Caprio, CFO Focused Technology and Boston Chapter Co-Chair. My name is Angela Tice, and I'm the Northeast Regional Director and National Membership Chair of the CFO Leadership Council. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we actually get started. You probably all realize that your lines are muted, and that is so that there are no distractions while our speakers are talking. However, we certainly encourage your questions and comments, so please feel free to use the chat, really the question area, to communicate. We welcome your interaction, and we want to make sure your needs are addressed, so please feel free to do so throughout the presentation. I'll be monitoring that area, and I will interrupt our speakers as I see your questions come through. We're also going to leave a little time at the end so that if you prefer to wait to either ask a question or comment, you'll have an opportunity to do so at that time. So that's basically it for the housekeeping, and now I'd like to hand it over to you, Jack, so that we can get the discussion underway.
Thank you, Angela, for that introduction. Thanks to all of you for jumping on this webinar. This should be a great conversation. As an introduction, my name's Jack McCullough. I'm the founder and president of the CFO Leadership Council. And as some of you know, we've been doing a series of the habits of highly effective CFOs. And we've been blessed to have two great CFOs who are going to talk about their experience on these habits. The habits today are working as a cross-functional leader and building elite teams. And before we get into it, I thought each of our speakers would like to take 30 seconds to introduce themselves to the audience. And why don't we start with you, Jonathan?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name's Jonathan Bigham. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer of Coffee Labs and the Strategic Agency. Those are two digital experiential agencies based in New York City. I've spent the last 20 some odd years in media, often sitting from the finance chair, but having run things like a video division, a licensing division, M&A and strategic planning, as well as day-to-day accounting. So I view today's topic as incredibly relevant, as I'm sure most of you do, and I'm looking forward to the call.
Great, thanks. Chris?
Thanks, Jack. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Caprio. I'm the CFO of Focused Technology. We're a IT services, managed services, and value-added reseller based out of Boston, but our customer base is all throughout New England. I've been the CFO here for about 2 years, and I manage really most of the back office in addition to finance and accounting, also HR, IT, training, legal oversight, and the project management team. Prior, I was CFO of an energy company, working for a venture capital firm to do some roll-ups of some energy companies in New England, and also prior to that, an engineering firm as well. So looking forward to today. Hopefully everyone has lots of questions, and appreciate everyone's time.
Sure, thanks. And what's great is both of you are on the steering committees in your respective chapters. So thanks for that as well. So why don't we talk first about the CFO's role as a cross-functional leader. And the position has really evolved. When the CFO position first came about, it was largely a finance and accounting position. Basically, the best accountant in a company would become the CFO of that company. And then over time, a lot of other functional areas were added to it. Typically human resources, IT, investor relations, facilities, things of that nature that would sort of fall under the administrative bucket. And today the job is truly cross-functional. There's few, if any, areas of an organization that a CFO doesn't touch. They're often involved in sales, marketing, customer support. They're in the product development part of the business as well. So it's truly, other than arguably the senior VP of HR and the president of the company, it's the most cross-functional job within an organization. And so with that said, why don't I ask a question to both of you, and Jonathan, if you can answer first, what's the best way? Yes.
Jack, Sorry, if you don't mind, I think we're going to kick off with a polling question. I should have told you that first, just to kind of get our audience participating a little bit. So I'm going to launch that right now, and then we can get into asking our speakers some questions as well. So here we go.
And what I like best about you, Angela, you always throw yourself on the sword. You told me 3 times, so.
You know I'm not shy. So the question here is, do you ever go on customer visits with your people? And so we're just getting the answers. We always like to give them just a second or two to answer them, and then I'll share with you what they tell us. Our speakers can't see what you're answering, so it's kind of cool. It lets me talk more. Okay, so basically everyone has voted. A little bit more. Okay. Here are the answers. 11% said frequently, 41% said occasionally, and 49% said never. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, that, and we'll ask the experts as we get into it, but that surprises me a little bit that basically half never go. And it's interesting, one of the things in doing this research, and I had access to, some really terrific CFOs who, highly competent and very open, but a few of them told me they actually call the CFOs of their 5 biggest customers on a regular basis just to check in and build a relationship with them. So the job has become a lot more customer focused, but apparently, that's an area that we can talk and maybe get them a little bit more involved in that process. So anyway, the first question that I'd like to ask, what's the best way for a CFO to increase collaboration across all departments? And Jonathan, I know you have some strong opinions on that. Love to hear from you first.
Sure, thank you. So the best companies that I've worked for, and one of the practices that I've put into place wherever I've been put in charge of the finance function, is to really embed finance team members at the division level. So as an example, in a media company, you've got a magazine with an ad sales brand. Most of them owned multiple magazines. Every brand had a finance team member that reported up into the CFO, but basically became the de facto source or numbers resource, if you will, for that brand or department or division. I found that makes everything from running day-to-day tasks or reporting much easier and consistent. Corporate board presentations flow a lot easier because numbers are consistently reported across divisions. The CFO has a resource that he or she can task on a regular basis for quick reach outs, give me the latest updates on product development expense. And most importantly, if you have a team that is working on product development or a new line, or working on the manufacturing plant, and they have a finance resource available to them where part of their job is to actually work out numbers and be a resource, you'd be amazed at how quickly you can determine and streamline things, such as not just beyond reporting, but cost metrics, how team members are incentivized, where they spend the bulk of not just their resources in terms of funding, but also just starting to look at the process. Having a numbers-based person who can communicate with non-numbers people or people who are either in manufacturing or content development is a huge resource, particularly when you get into sales as well. If you're going out and your sales team is putting forth a pitch and the numbers have been vetted, you can be certain that the clients are going to sharpen up their pencils and take a look at that. And I've seen, salespeople who are terrific just get, that much more confident because they know their numbers are bulletproof. They've looked at them twice. They've been vetted by the finance team and they've come through. And you can even take that one level beyond that, which is that your finance person might actually give them some scenarios to run. So if a client comes up and says, well, can you do it for 10% less? That having had that resource usually front loads that. So if your organization is not already embedding or forcing the conversation and having a finance team member down at that level, I would strongly encourage it, simply because it just it makes a world of difference. I've worked at companies that didn't have it, and I've worked at companies that have had it. And ever since I worked at the first company that had it, and that's been my standard operating procedure since. Just trust me.
That's great stuff. Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit different, but in a similar path to that is, certainly sharing numbers with your stakeholders. I've come into organizations as CFOs where, division managers, VPs just had no idea, company KPIs, what they were, what the budget was, what our revenue was. And I think it's important to, reach out first. So we'll get into further discussion about how you as CFOs can get out there. And, we saw that polling question. But I think it starts with you beginning that conversation by involving these vice presidents or other division managers in the budget process, at least their division of the budget process, reviewing them. The cadence is up to you, whether you think it's weekly, monthly, quarterly, depending on your organization. But I think it's important to start that, certainly as a CFO, we're all well aware of our company's figures. But I think it's important for the operation side of the business to understand those figures. So when we make cost-cutting suggestions or look at marketing budgets to what to approve, they understand where we are in terms of our budget and how profitable or unprofitable we are in a given period.
Yeah, that's great. One of the folks I spoke to when I did the research, she was a CFO at Gillette, which is now part of Procter & Gamble. But she told me she actually used to have once a month, they'd actually switch team meetings. So she would actually, once a month, she would run the sales organization meetings, and she would have the VP of sales run the finance and accounting meetings. And it really gave each a more sympathy and a better understanding of how how the other needs, what the needs were for the others, and what the day-to-day reality was. So anytime you're getting people talking to each other, I think that's a good thing. My first job, the CFO, he used to call marketing arts and crafts, which was sort of funny, but it wasn't really a highly productive thing, right? So anyway, so that's great. Anyway, Chris, when we were talking, and I've known Chris for several years, but time is always an issue for CFOs. It just seems like it's always busy season these days. And so what are some of the things CFOs can do ahead of time to help ensure that you have time to dedicate to meeting with, learning from, and becoming a cross-functional leader? Because it's not like your other responsibilities are just disappearing.
Yeah, I think it starts a lot with the day-to-day handling of your organization. I had the fortune of, during my interview process a couple of years ago at this position, to discuss the existing accounting strengths and weaknesses, and was surprised at how open a couple, the CEO, we had a chairman of the board, a couple other people were, with the lack of knowledge, we'll say, in that department. And it was a requirement of part of me coming on board was to be able to hire a controller. And while I understand in different businesses, it's maybe not easy to add two people if we have somebody but I think it's important to get somebody that runs that day to day. If you're a CFO and you want to go to sales meetings and do some other things, it's going to be very difficult to do that if you're in charge of the close. And I kind of use that as a measurement. So if you're able to, even if it's even a little bit lower resource, but get yourself as much as you can out of the day-to-day and be able to decide, hey, there's a sales call that you could be valuable on, and it's during the close. Well, if you always have to choose, well, it's the close, I can't leave for a day or two, or make a travel arrangement to go to a conference, I think it's really important to get somebody else that's in charge of the day-to-day as best you can, and identify it in your budget ahead of time if you don't have it now, or certainly lean on that controller or senior accounting manager that you have, because I think that's the first step to being able to get out of the office, is get yourself somebody that runs the day-to-day, and you can stay at the kind of strategic level if possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, a lot of controllers are doing jobs now that 10, 12 years ago were thought of as CFO level jobs. There was an article I read, controllers are the new CFO. It sounds like working in your organization, there's a lot of truth to that. You hire somebody that you can trust. So But cool, Jonathan, anything to add building on to what Chris just shared?
Only to say I agree completely. I mean, Chris brought up a very good point, which is that as the CFO, we're really tasked with two things. And I think from a board level and a major stakeholder perspective, those types of meetings that happen on a quarterly basis and then your annual strategic reviews, they're going to be asking the high level questions that if you're so down in the weeds on the day-to-day, you're not going to have the perspective, and it's not going to be as valuable a contribution, in my opinion. So I think Chris hit it right on the head. As a CFO, find a solid number two as a controller that can get versed in the day-to-day, that you trust implicitly, that you've developed that relationship with, that your CEO should be just as comfortable if it's a day-to-day question if you're out there, because that CFO knows that you're either at a trade show or, at a client visit or working with IT to kind of go out to a new source, whatever the division might be. Getting out of the office is probably, and being able to tackle strategic or higher level tasks makes you much more valuable, not just to your CEO, but to your board and to the company. And you can only do that if you follow, the advice that Chris has laid out, which is get out of the weeds, have a dedicated resource and team, and make sure your finance team knows, this is the closing schedule. Here are the questions. Let's go through it and, continue on. But far too many CFOs make the mistake of just sitting in their office and focusing on the close, which, as you know, happens every 3 weeks. And that just, leads to blinders and can get you caught short.
Okay, that's great. Good stuff. So, Jonathan, why don't we stick with you for the next one, since I know you have strong feelings on it, but how can a CFO make an impact throughout the company, not just within the world of finance and accounting?
So I think, Chris touched on this a little bit, and, I think it's absolutely critical to assume ownership, not just of the reporting requirements as they go across the organization, but also to have a dialogue and go out and talk to each of your stakeholders. Your sales team may feel that there are certain KPIs that they just don't utilize. My favorite question at every monthly meeting is, what are we going to stop doing? What are we going to not, what reports do you just hate? And you'd be amazed at the responses that you can get where they just say, look, we gather all this data, we don't use it. What do you guys use it for? And sometimes there are specific corporate needs, but oftentimes you'll find that there are certain metrics that people have just always looked at, and you can say, well, look, is this really how we should be evaluating our business? And I think if you assume as CFO the ownership of what's going to be reported, but also take the open view that, VP of sales or head of IT or HR, how are we going to act? What are the key metrics that matter to this function? And how do we incorporate those so that we can track them regularly? There's the old adage that whatever gets tracked and measured is what gets done. You really need to, as CFO, start having that conversation and be willing to actually take things off of your report. And if it, sometimes that goes all the way up to the board level, where certain board members, insist on seeing data on a regular basis that it's only used for board meetings. And that's a question that, needs to be raised and discussed. How are we evaluating our business? What are the key metrics when we look at profitability or lifetime value of customer or cost savings? What are we tying our incentive packages to? How do we want to incentivize people? If you have a sales team and they're paid based on the percentage of market share versus profitability, that's going to have a very different outcome as to how you tweak it. So, to have an impact throughout the company and to really, move the needle, I think that starts with what report information and data are you gathering and communicating back, and how does that lead the discussion as to how everyone's tracking against the targets that you've set.
Okay, that's great. Chris, anything to build on?
Yeah, I mean, I love that, what Jonathan mentioned about the meeting. What do people hate? What do we want to stop doing? I think that's, I'm going to stop bringing that to my organization. But I think he mentioned, and just expanding upon that, is the monthly meetings or whatever cadence meetings you have. How we can add value is we can call those meetings because maybe they start with the discussion of, results for the month, for the quarter. But getting, the sales folks in the room, in our case, the engineering, or in your case, any operations function, other C-level executives in a room on a regular basis. You're presenting information, but you're also looking for them to present information. I think that's how it starts, is, you're bringing things to the table that are problems for the organization, or issues within the organization, and you're utilizing your skill sets during those meetings to understand and to help solve those problems. I think that's how it starts, and then certainly leads to, over time, continuing those discussions individually. Just like Jonathan mentioned, sitting with them, going through their reports now that they've had a say in. So, which ones they got rid of, which ones they want, and how you can help them, getting them to understand you're there to support them. You're not there to, cut their expenses or do things, maybe some of the stereotypical things of the past CFOs. Really focusing on those monthly meetings as a starting point to get in front of other executives of the organization and discuss key, important strategic topics.
Actually, to Chris's point, we had a sales meeting that we actually changed the whole cadence of it. It used to be, when I first started, the conversation was all of how do we do, and are we tracking, and everything else. Now we distribute the monthly update report 2 days ahead of time, and the agenda for the topic is, how does the next 12 months look? We don't even talk about, unless there's something really glaring that's come up and needs, that requires some attention. But the whole focus of the monthly sales meeting, review with finance, if you will, is not, here's how you did and here's what you have left and you guys are tracking and this is terrific, to, all right, what's in the client pipeline? What are we looking at? What additional resources might you need to, double this account or triple this account? And that's kind of changed the whole tone of the conversation, that we've now got salespeople into what I like to call the rolling 4-quarter forecast mode, where they're always looking out 12 months. So budgets become a lot easier, problems and spotting those becomes a lot easier, and it's just really helped with how we run the business.
That's great. Angela?
Yes, the perfect timing. I was just going to launch our second polling question. I'm going to do that right now, and I think the question is actually perfect. And the question is, how deeply are you involved in your organization's strategic meetings? And people are answering. Okay, I think that's going to be it. And I'll share these with everyone. So 9% are minimally involved, 21% review financial assumption and create from that. 56 say that I'm deeply involved in the process, which I think is good. 14% say I lead the process.
Wow, that's actually closer to what I would have expected. That's typically not a lot of CFOs actually lead the process, but they're deeply involved beyond just running financial models and stuff. Guys, are you deeply involved in the process, or?
I lead the process. Yes, we had no strategic direction before I got here, and helped lead the process on my end.
I see.
I partner with the CEO, in part given my background in M&A and a couple other things, and just the overall size of the company. We wear many hats, but even in larger organizations, it's been, a critical role to lead the process, set out the timeline, set the assumptions, and, over the course of a couple of weeks, cobble together a plan that everybody buys into and is both challenging and yet, we hope achievable.
That's great. I think we have one more question on this topic. And so that question is, sometimes becoming a cross-functional leader starts with managing outside the world of finance and accounting. If a CFO walks in only managing a small piece and not departments like HR, IT, what's the best way to raise this without upsetting or potentially risking divisiveness with the team? And Chris, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I think it's, really during that strategic process, identifying those functional areas and who is currently in charge of them, and if they're the best resource or if you are. I think there's certainly opportunities in most organizations for a CFO to review these areas and identify who is leading them. For instance, I had a prior organization where the CEO was in charge of HR and was dealing with some employee issues that I would deem to be low level, but because the HR director at the time wanted to run it through their manager, their boss, it came in the CEO's lap and kind of pulled them away from things. So I used that as an opportunity to say, based on prior experience, and I've managed that department before, the idea is you want the CFO and the sales team and the operations team to be outwardly focused. And I've tried to maintain as much as I can control over the internally focused departments. So really utilizing that experience. Another example, a project management team that I'm managing now felt that there was they really didn't have process and controls in place. So utilize that in a discussion with the CEO that, that's a CFO's background a lot is around, process and controls. Granted, it's more on projects, not numbers, but there's still budgets and hours involved. So I think, it's obviously a sensitive topic and, you don't want to frustrate maybe who's managing it, but, I assume in all cases, CFO is reporting to the CEO, and if you have a good relationship, you're discussing these types of things. And again, they're all in the realm of trying to make the organization better. You're not doing it to be political or to upset anyone. You feel whoever you're replacing as the lead of that department, they're now going to have more time to be revenue producers or to focus on what their skill sets are, and maybe they were just put in place because of the way the organization grew. So certainly keep an open communication line with the CEO and be honest with him or her and yourself about what you feel confident that you can manage, assuming you've done the things we've been talking about for the first 20-25 minutes, which is being able to give up some of the day-to-day stuff and have the ability to focus on the higher level of strategic stuff.
That's great. Jonathan, what do you think?
I agree with what Chris said. I think that as a CFO that focuses more on strategic, it simply makes sense. Also, when you get into things like IT or benefits or HR, all of these functions tend to have very high dollar amounts attached to them. And a change in one area can very quickly have a significant impact on the company. And in my experience, it just makes sense. CFOs typically are always present at board meetings, if not members of the board. And just having those departments fall under the purview of the CFO brings greater consistency, greater visibility, and also just allows the CFO, similar to how we talked about in the first question, I think, of having a stellar controller to handle the day-to-day. You can find some absolutely phenomenal HR professionals, IT professionals, et cetera, that, I love my IT, my head of IT. The last 3 heads of IT that I've had have been brilliant, but they have absolutely no interest in the day-to-day, cobbling things together. They perform much better when you take that responsibility away from them and just say, I'm here to give you resources and manage it. Let me run interference. And more often than not, you can get, when the discussion is led by the CFO, we need to improve our benefits for the following reasons, and this is why it makes financial sense. Or we need to make the following investments in greater systems, whether it's a system upgrade, a general ledger conversion, security, infrastructure. When those conversations come from someone who's based in the finance seat, I've found that there are far fewer objections, and just the methodology and the whole approach to it tends to lead from the conversation of, how do I come up with a financial scenario that justifies making this change or investment? And so I think one reason we're seeing CFOs become more involved in these areas is precisely for that reason. You no longer have, or there's far less chance or likelihood of a disconnect between, what it's going to cost, what we say it's going to cost at the outset, and the board approves it. 6 months later, the CFO's at a board meeting saying, well, the assumptions were wrong. If the CFO is kind of leading that task and that charge, you'll almost never have that conversation, except for an external force that couldn't be foreseen. And I think that's simply because of the discipline and the background and the approach of, when a CFO looks at a task, it always comes back to the numbers. What's it going to cost? What do we expect to get in return? And do we go ahead? If I recommend it, this is for the following reasons.
Okay, that's great. Anything to add to that, Chris? Or
No, that makes a lot of sense what Jonathan's saying. Absolutely.
you guys are of one mind. You're very agreeable with one another. I was hoping that like the Geraldo Rivera show, and you guys would be throwing furniture at each other, which I guess is tough to do at a webinar. So, Angela, are there any questions from the group before we move on?
There are none so far, but I'll let you know. I will interrupt you as soon as one comes through. And that is a reminder. Actually, I think I'm seeing a question now. So one sec. Let's see who's got what. Yes, there is a question. And it is, should not the CFO focus on being a cross-functional partner rather than the leader of other functions, HR, IT, to avoid the risk of lacking experiences and capabilities?
I would say certainly you don't want to offer yourself up if you have not had the experience, for sure. I mean, I agree with that. But over time, certainly you're going to be working closely with IT and HR to start, and potentially other areas. And I think you'd be surprised, maybe giving away confidence in myself, but sometimes you realize you're a better fit for whoever's managing that department, just based on what the objectives and the strategic plan is. If things are getting ignored, if certainly there are times where in HR, for instance, maybe if they're reporting directly to the CEO is not giving them enough time or input when it comes to budgetary potentially or other policies that need to be implemented. So you can actually benefit your organization by having a different C-level executive managing some of these departments to be more successful than maybe they're getting ignored at the current time.
Makes sense, Jonathan.
I would agree with that. No,
Sorry.
I would agree with that. And also, in my last response, I wasn't trying to supplant or to say that what IT or HR or other functions do is not important or is replicable from someone who's got an MBA in finance and is running the close and everything. But I do think that from a strategic standpoint, I think if those functions fall under the CFO, there is greater visibility, at least in the companies where I have worked. There is much greater visibility at a board level, and it just forces the process. It's not replacing it. In fact, in New York, our last event, Mike Bruno was the head of HR when I was at Rodale, was a phenomenal guy. He would be the first to tell you that, he was an active participant, but what made it that much better from his standpoint was knowing that it was the CFO that was actually helping to champion what he was advocating, the need to revamp an incentive program, or why we needed to come in and, update a few things, completely change over a few things. When I first got to one company, we had a staff that there were 35 women who were under the age of 30 working on a brand. And the budget had no planning for maternity leave, as an example. That whole process came about, and this is several years back. But part of the reason that got flagged as we need to change this was precisely because of the relationship that HR and the CFO had. And it was the CFO that actually went through and just said, we're kidding ourselves if we don't plan on, out of a staff of 30 people, at least 4 of them on any given year are going to be out on maternity leave. And we're short-sighted if we're not doing something like this. And so we want these people to come back. We need to create an environment that makes it, attractive to them, not just while they're working, but while they're new parents. And what is that going to mean? It was a significant investment for the company, but probably the smartest thing we ever did. That whole partnership, if you will, I believe was largely due to the fact that the CFO and the head of HR were, linked on the same team, because ultimately HR came up through the CFO.
So this is Angela. I do have another question, and I have a feeling, Jonathan, you've kind of given a little bit of the answer, but I'll ask the question anyway. Being CFO, of course, we know more than most. But how do you engage and lead cross-functional peers who exhibit little concern for bigger picture financial matters? Plus, I have a particularly young team that doesn't appreciate the power of working together that makes it particularly difficult to engage.
So I think part of that just comes to having that dialogue and leading the culture. It is, and let me see if I can brace this. That's also another reason where it's very easy. If the CFO is ultimately responsible for that function, then you can try as you might, but if people are having a difficult time getting on board, that often leads to the type of conversations that, look, this is the direction in which we want to go. This is the structure of the company. Here's where it is. I mean, part of, in my experience, being able to always come back and be grounded in the numbers, because at least once a month, that's what the company is going to focus on, and that's a very clear-cut way to tell against your benchmarks. We set out a goal. Are we achieving it? And are we pacing? And then I also think it comes back to what we talked about before. Are you having the dialogue and conveying to either your peers or their subordinates or your subordinates why it is that we're tracking the information that we have and why these metrics matter? I had an audit partner who this has stuck with me. This was early in my career. He just said, look, we're a light bulb manufacturer. And he said, it wasn't until we had a corporate meeting and we said to everybody, hey, don't judge us by the 800 million in revenue that we're bringing in on the top. Because do you know how many light bulbs we need to sell to pay for, a pad of paper? Let's put it in that metric. And he said that was just, the room went silent. So I think the more you can help communicate the metrics that you're tracking and how your company's performing and why they matter, you may get additional buy-in. I don't know if that's answered the question. Chris, you may have a different mindset. But in part, there's always going to be challenge of getting people to come along. And culture in any organization is critical as to how you perform. Sometimes that means that there are going to be difficult decisions, and it may ultimately lead to someone leaving the company.
Yeah, I think it's a great segue too to the discussion on building high performance teams. I think a lot of that we're going to discuss and can come out of that will certainly help answer that when you have people that aren't on board, if that's a decision from a strategic perspective that the organization has made. So I think that's a perfect segue.
Indeed, I was thinking the same thing, Chris. So fantastic. So let's chat a little about building high performance teams. And, it's interesting on the cross-functional talk, it came up, I think, on every single question, the importance of having the right team around you. But the research I gave here was, how CFOs are involved in building a team for the long term. And also they were involved deeply outside the world of their own empire. So, one CFO I spoke to told me that he was like the critical recruiter of fellow executives and key engineers and that sort of thing. And he was just really good at recruiting talent to his firm. And he interviewed virtually every employee in the company that was hired. So, Angela, do we want to start with a group question, or should I get into our conversation first?
No, thanks for that, Jack. I think it's a great time to do a polling question, and then we'll only have one more. So here I'm going to launch it right now so that everyone can answer the question. And the question is, does the senior HR professional in your company report into, I believe is the question. Just give them a couple more seconds. Okay. So the answers could be either yes or no, and it's 25% said yes and 75% no.
Wow, that's a little surprising to me. Although we do have a lot of controllers on this call too, so I suspect if we only had CFOs answered, we might get a different result. But I might have guessed actually the other way around. If you believe statistics, 2/3 of companies have HR reporting into the CFO these days. So you guys both run your HR organizations to a degree. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yes,
that's correct.
Cool, great. Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Angela. Okay, so the first question, and why don't we start with Chris this time? A lot of people think of building teams within their own direct line of reports, but how do CFOs help build teams across their organization and not just people who report up through them?
So going back to your thing of 2/3 HR, but I look at two areas that I've been able to help in this with this line of questioning and help grow teams outside of my organization. One is certainly during the budget process, which all finance people are heavily involved in, and two is during the performance review process. So, the idea is hopefully as finance leaders, we're building a highly performing team on our end. In order to get that across other organizations, you need to have those conversations with those managers. And during the review process, understanding, I've gotten heavily involved with the results and meeting with management after the fact or through the salary increase area. And you really get into some good discussions because, most managers, maybe they're having 5 to 10 people somewhere in that range reporting to them. And you realize where they're spending most of their time, tends to be on the 2 or 3 areas where they feel they have the weakest employee. And certainly during the budget process, same thing, you can see their list of employees up there, how much they're making, what their titles are, and really just starting that conversation about, do we have the right team in place? And then have they utilized pipeline recruiting? I mean, I've heard many times with, well, I'm not sure I love that employee, but, I need somebody to do that position. And really when you drill into it, it's just because they don't have any other options. They're not in charge of recruiting. Maybe recruiting hasn't put anybody in front of them in the last 6 months. So I've always tried to enforce or start pipeline recruiting with our organization, certainly for the key positions that we tend to hire the most for, and have those managers see that there are other opportunities out there to hire more talented, more seasoned, or a different skill set of employee that they need. And usually those conversations are much easier to have during those 2 times, the budget review and the performance review time, if your company does have them, because they've spent time thinking about their resource, what resources they need the following year, or what skill sets they lack. And it's really been a good opportunity for us to sit down and review our employee base and get an understanding of what areas we need to improve upon.
That's great. Jonathan, anything to add to that?
No, I think I completely agree with Chris. In fact, especially when you talk about performance reviews, the only thing that I would add to it is make sure that your company allows for movement, not just up through the organization, but also across departments. I found that when you actually take the blinders off and make it known throughout the company, hey, I've got 2 years of experience, I'm doing this, but I'm really interested in working across the hall, or I just love manufacturing, fascinates me. It's been Passion of mine off to the side, I'd like to trade that in instead of doing spreadsheets. That can really make a difference when it comes to helping out the organization over the long term. I mean, Chris kind of hit it on the head. Hiring is probably, the biggest challenge that I look at, because in getting people to start to think of, if you want to achieve the following things that you've outlined in your plan, what does it look like on paper, and who amongst your team currently will still be here when when we look 9, 12 months down the road, 18 months down the road, and who will they have to hire? And will they, if we're actually talking about doubling a client base, is that person ready to manage someone under her? Or is that, person really ready to manage 2 people under him or her? And so having that conversation and being an active participant throughout the organization when it comes time to performance reviews allows you to see, are all the departments and managers really hitting on the key characteristics that we as an organization need? And do they have the wherewithal and the authority to actually start planning ahead and take the first leap? Most companies manage hiring as, you have to go into HR, you have to make everything, set, you have to post it, you have to go through, there's a process. And that's not to belittle the need to hire smart, but I think the more that a CFO, and this gets back to one of the reasons why I think it's important that some of the admin functions like HR report up to a CFO, you have the leverage to say, go and hire that person. Or you need more gunpowder, fine. You have authorization to hire 3, provided we, go through the normal process, but let's accelerate it. And so I think, performance reviews are incredibly important, not just for the employees, but for the managers. And you'd be surprised if you're not in your organization already tracking them and having them all come into a central area to get feedback and to find out who are our star performers, what are their common characteristics, how are we rewarding them. The CFO needs to be a part of that conversation, because it can really be a game changer if you bring that level up to that process. And then most importantly, just allow people to cross the street within your company. If you've got an AP clerk who wants to work in manufacturing, that can only help you. You've invested time and money in that person. They're not leaving to go to another opportunity somewhere down the road. They're actually saying, I want to stay in the company, but this is a more appealing function. Why would we turn that down? And why wouldn't we, give that person a raise that's comparable to if we hired out on the street? I've helped stop a couple of big mistakes by being the one person at the table who kind of sits there and says, wait a second, we like this person, we'd like them to stay. Are we really going to tell them that they can only stay if they stay within this track? What does that say about us as an organization?
No, that's great. I mean, it's what it's all about, right? We've all seen probably that cartoon that, it actually, so one person says, what if we spend all this money to train people and they leave? And then the other person says, what if we don't spend any money to train people and they stay, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yep.
In this job market, you can't pick up the press without seeing something about the war for talent. So you've got to give professionals a lot of options to keep them happy and healthy and satisfied. So cool. Why don't we move on to the next question? Jonathan, you've had a lot of success building teams in a lot of diverse organizations. What are a few things you can do to advise CFOs to build high performance teams?
So I have always made it a priority to, and it sounds like a cliche, but invest in your talent. And by that, I do 2 things. I had a manager when I was 25 who insisted that I, get away from my desk at least once a month. And whether it was attending a panel, whether it was going for CPE credits, whether it was going to a trade show, and that actually can have a big impact. I would say to every CFO, if you're not already having your AP managers and payroll managers regularly attend conferences and seminars, you should be. There have been organizations where I've worked at where I've had to actually take, finance has a T&E budget that's almost never used. And I made a change on that. And we basically used that to send a bunch of people off to some conferences. So if we're in advertising, we'd send, I just had a bunch of people go to CinemaCon. Why? Because, there's a lot of innovation that's going on, and we're a consumer-facing organization, and we deal with brands that want to connect with consumers. And so not just the salespeople, but I actually sent an AP manager. Why? That will just make them a better employee and help them understand where we are. And, the budget's been tasked anyway. Not just your salespeople, but your finance people need to be going to these things. If your company has an annual sales meeting, a couple people from finance need to go. A couple of people from IT should go. A lot of companies look at the cost and say, well, that's an extra 10 people over 3 days. Look, it's nothing. Spend the money, because your own staff will help and understand the perspective of what your sales team, what matters to your clients, or what the IT people have to go through to actually do that. You'd be amazed at the conversations that can get uncovered. And also just, sending a bunch of people over to CinemaCon and having them come back and talk about, gee, I could see this working for a brand, or how come we do a lot of coding, we do a lot of interactive websites, we do a lot of, all the branding at the NCAA tournament that was done by us. And when you come in and you're in a stadium, what else could we do in a stadium? We've probably got about 3 pages of notes from things that are going on in other trade shows. And, for $25,000 or $30,000 a year, it's money well spent. And that's what helps keep, I have an AP manager who loves coming to work every day. Why? Because she's not just sitting at her desk at her computer. If you're in a company like a lot of us are, where okay, the quarter didn't go so well, we've got to cut back on a couple things, absolutely. But there's a lot of stuff. We're based in New York. There are hundreds of meetups. There are hundreds of organizations that go to. Look at the CFO Leadership Council. That's once a month where we get to interact with people and talk shop. Ours is a C-level organization, but there are plenty of organizations for people at the VP or director level, or even just the new, manager level. When I started in publishing, there was a group of us that worked at 4 or 5 different publishing companies, and we used to call it the Thursday night drinking club, which was more of a networking club because a lot of us didn't drink. But every Thursday we'd get together and just, talk about stuff. And without giving away secrets, but just, what system are you guys using? We've gotten our close down to 3 days instead of 8. You'd be surprised, and a lot of this comes from the top. If you're not encouraging your staff and your other department managers to continue to invest in people, it's going to come back to bite you.
That makes sense. Chris, anything to add to that?
No, I couldn't agree more with Jonathan. Sometimes the only thing I found is, as CFO, sometimes you have to force people, as he was mentioning, to some of these conferences, and I've had some success signing myself up for it, and basically knowing I wasn't going to go and telling my controller, okay, we signed up for this, we need to go, I need you to go. And it kind of gets them out of the office, and I agree, getting your team out of the office, looking at and learning best practices from other organizations is extremely important, because like you as a CFO, they need to get out of the office, and it mixes things up for them for sure, but also getting an opportunity to see what other companies are doing. And I certainly recommend the most GL packages out there have annual conferences. That's something that absolutely your controller and probably an accounting manager, an AP manager, at least 2 or 3 people from your organization, you should be budgeting for those. Those are extremely beneficial and valuable time away from the office.
That's great. Angela, are there any questions before we go on to the next? I think we're down to about 6 or 7 minutes.
Yes, and there are no questions at this time.
Okay, great. So, Chris, we spoke a little bit about the juggling act of balancing long-term with short-term, and that's always challenging for CFOs. But is it all right to hire for the short-term while still looking for the long term, knowing if the business doesn't achieve its growth objectives, you might be forced to make some unpleasant decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it's all obviously important to get close done, and there could be challenges you have within your accounts payable department or getting invoices out for cash flow purposes. So, certainly there's opportunities there to look at and speak with some temporary help if needed. But there are always going to be times where, you always should look to hire for down the road what your strategic plan is, what you're going to need. But sometimes, there are opportunities where you just have a need today. If you want to stay away from having to make those tough decisions, that's where, temporary agencies and staffing agencies come in to fill those gaps. You certainly want to be careful with hiring for mid-level or higher positions. I would say you definitely want to maintain those with the strategic long-term vision in mind, but there are definitely day-to-day processes or day-to-day jobs that you're going to need to fill in order to get there as you come into a new organization and you realize your invoicing is 2 weeks behind, or payables, you're getting calls about not paying bills on time. Sometimes you just have to make a decision to hire somebody to help with some day-to-day stuff. But I would suggest really keeping that focused on the lower level positions, and when you need to hire a manager or need to hire somebody above that, you absolutely should be focused on your strategic plan and hiring in that area.
That makes a lot of sense. Jonathan, anything to add to that?
I completely agree. I mean, we've all been there. If your receivables, if you've got a hole in your receivables, it's absolutely critical you get someone in who can just manage that day to day and keep the task focused on that. And that's one of the challenging parts of this role, is balancing the short term and the long term, and being able to do it. But I think Chris hit it on the head.
Cool. When I did this research, the advice that I got over and over again was, when you're building your team, think a few years out. Don't think of what your needs are today. Yeah, someone said you can teach skills, but you can't teach passion and energy and commitment. So, find the team that's going to be running your organization 3 years out. And, I think that's probably great advice in theory. In fact, it's great advice anyway, but, it's also difficult when you're putting out fires every day of your life. So, how do you balance that? Not only sort of the issue that you might not hit your objectives, but sure, this person's a talent that can help us 3 years from now, but what I really need is, a different skill set just to make it through this month. Do you guys ever faced with that juggling act, and how have you dealt with it?
I would say really during the interview process. I mean, I've definitely had that happen in the past, and you're looking for that resource that, here's a skill set I'm going to need 12, 18 months down the road, but you're upfront with them saying, hey, look, it's going to take 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is. I need you to focus in this area, and get their reaction to, their willingness to do that. And then obviously once they come in, your job is to show them that light at the end of the tunnel. But there are definitely opportunities to, if you know that ahead of time, to bring that up during the interview process as part of your screening to make sure you get the right candidate. This is where we're going, whether it's a new ERP system or we're going to be, automating this process. But until then, I just need someone to do payables or whatever it may be. And I've had success, where people know coming in, hey, I'm going to learn, I'm going to understand at the ground level, and then as the company grows, I'm going to be able to fill this type of position.
Okay, sounds good. Jonathan, anything to build?
Just along those points. I mean, that's really being able to communicate an effective roadmap, and getting buy-in from people, direct when they start, but also making sure that they understand that, look, the situation could change 3 months from now. And having you touched on it before, where it's, if you have someone who's taken a passionate interest in it and likes what they do and is a team player, and can kind of roll with the punches and say, all right, this is a little different than what I was expecting, but it's still challenging work. It's work with a purpose that's going to lead somewhere. Yeah, okay, I'm still on board and I can put up with it. And a lot of that has to do with making sure that you stick to that timetable. That are we still headed in that direction? Do we still see, light at the end of the tunnel, as Chris said? And what's the timing on that? And do everything we can to hit that. But still, it's important, especially in today's environment. I mean, part of working in a company, and one of the things that I've experienced, a lot of people are wearing multiple hats. A lot of people their own roles are expanding, and they're being required to do more that's outside of what, 20 years ago, if you were in accounts payable, that was it. And now there's a lot of more cross-functional and interactiveness across the company in different roles. And so part of that, I think, is, people are expecting it more, but also it's how we as managers manage that to get the right balance and actually say, I'm going to find a role that gets this person eventually to where their strongest suit is, because that will only benefit the company and make my life easier.
No, that's great. I think we actually are just about at the end of our schedule. So, Angela, I think we can maybe address a question if the audience has one. Otherwise, maybe you can wrap things up for us.
Sure. Let me just see. I did see a question come up. People are actually saying it was terrific. And other than that, I will say to everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. And I do hope that you did receive some valuable and practicable information from our speakers. Definitely mark your calendars for Monday, June 10th for the final part in our 5-part series, CFO as Scholar and Financial Expert. So since there are no other questions and we are right out of time, I will say too, this does conclude our presentation on habits of the highly successful CFO. CFO as cross-functional team builder, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
See everybody in Boston in May.
Thank you.